There are two types of podcasters: those who are constantly chasing downloads and wondering why their shows aren't monetizing, and podcasters who are obsessed with getting more of their listeners, binging their back catalog, and following along for their future episodes. And after analyzing hundreds of podcasters across multiple different niches, I've found 5 mistakes that keeps business owners stuck with slow and steady growth even after years of podcasting. And in this video, I want to reveal what those mistakes are, as well as giving you simple fixes you can make to grow and monetize your podcast way faster. Now, if you're watching this video, the likelihood is you want to grow and monetize your podcast way faster. So the question becomes, what fundamentally has to happen in order for a podcast to grow and monetize way faster? Well, the first thing a podcast needs to be able to do is turn more strangers into listeners. People who are seeing your promotional clips on social media, or a promotional email you might have sent out, or just those browsing freely and organically on Apple and Spotify. If you can't convince them to click play and listen to your show for the first time, your podcast will never grow. The second thing that you need to be able to do is, once they've listened to your show, you need a way to keep those listeners coming back for future content and episodes. If you have 1,000 new listeners this month who discover your podcast, they listen once, and you weren't able to keep them around consuming more of your content, your podcast will never grow. So again, the second thing we need to do is to be able to keep those listeners coming back for more. And then a final thing in order to grow the show, which is the most obvious one, is we need a way to consistently reach more of the right listeners for your podcast. We need exposure, right? And if you can't get constant exposure, your show won't grow. If you're just reaching the same 1,000 people month after month, it doesn't really matter if you're just reaching the exact same people. Now, here's the thing. If you're in a spot where you're having meaningful conversations and the feedback you do get from listeners tell you how amazing your show is and how valuable it is, you're a bit confused as to why the show maybe isn't growing as fast as you'd like. Maybe you've been at it for a couple of years. For a lot of people, they draw the conclusion that what they need in order to grow is more exposure. They need to promote more on social media. They need to get bigger guests onto their podcast. Then you need to do whatever you can in order to get massive amounts of exposure onto your show. But here's the thing. If you're already posting on social media, consistently publishing your content on Apple and Spotify for the last couple of years, had meaningful conversations with big guests onto your podcast, the likelihood is you're already getting tons of exposure onto your show. And this is what I see with so many business owners I work with on a one-on-one basis. They are already posting on social media, sharing promotional clips, but their shows aren't growing. And it's because people skip over step number 1 and step number 2, which is, how do we turn more strangers who do see you promoting on social media into listeners for your podcast? And then step number 2, which is, how do we convince those listeners to keep coming back for more and binging your content? That's really important and powerful. Point number 2 is what I want to focus on within this video. Most podcasters who are struggling to grow, and the likelihood is, if you're in a spot where you're struggling to grow, you probably don't have a retention strategy, meaning you don't have a strategy to keep listeners coming back for more. Now, there are very obvious mistakes that people make if you're someone who wants to grow a podcast that builds your personal brand and allows you to generate sales, either through selling your own stuff or sponsorship. If you can't nurture listeners long-term and build a deep relationship with them because they're just coming and leaving, your show will never grow. So today, I'm going to reveal what those 5 things are that you might be screwing up that makes it impossible for your show to grow because you're not able to keep more listeners coming back for more. So mistake number 1 is having an unoptimized intro that sells the listen and benefits of your overall podcast. Now, this might sound a bit weird, like how does your intro affect whether or not someone will keep coming back for more? I remember we had a client called Jane, and Jane had been podcasting for around about 2 years, but she was still stuck with slow growth, no leads, and a podcast that just wasn't making any money. For her, she came to us wanting help, believing that what she needed was a new exposure tactic, a new way to get more listeners to discover her show. But the thing was, her podcast was actually a decent size. She was getting several hundred downloads per episode, and she was already constantly promoting on social media. She had incredible guests and top authority leaders in the industry that she had interviewed on the show. So we knew she was already getting a bunch of exposure. The issue that we found was that when we reviewed her intro, she had 40% of listeners who would drop after the first 90 seconds of the episode. Let's say she had 300 listeners for an episode. It meant that nearly half of them dropped off after the first minute. Now, this is a big issue because even though her content was great, the fact that people didn't listen through to the episode meant that their entire experience of her podcast wasn't great. And if the entire experience of a podcast wasn't great, they weren't incentivized to keep coming back for more because they just didn't get the value. It also meant that when she had her calls to action to join her newsletter, to buy her stuff, which was in the middle of an episode or towards the end, half of the people who were meant to hear it didn't hear it. So generating sales from a podcast was hard. Growing the show was even harder because people clicked play, excited for the episode, and then left within the first 90 seconds. And this is what we see with so many other podcasts out there. The majority of podcasters don't really have an optimized intro for their shows. They either have something that's way too long and boring and drawn out, or they talk about the guest bio, which again is long, boring, and drawn out. And they never think about, how do I convince this person who's just clicked play? How do I show them the value of this particular episode? And how do I actually sell my overall podcast? Now, a simple way you can do this is by, number one, just getting rid of long, boring intros. That's the first thing, right? And number two, just starting off by stating 3 benefits a new listener will gain from that particular episode. And when you name these 3 benefits, you might say why this is a current problem, how to actually fix it, and 3 little tricks to help you overcome it way faster. You just start off with your intro by stating the exact thing listeners will gain. Because they're not just going to stick around and hope they're going to get a bunch of value. Within the first 90 seconds, they're making their mind up on whether or not to keep listening or whether to leave. So we need to give them an incentive as to why they should keep listening. Now, for our client Jane, we fixed her intro, we made it shorter, added those 3 benefits, as well as just stating exactly what her show was about. This is what you call a tagline. When we added this to her intro, people clicked play, knew exactly what they were going to gain from the episode and why they couldn't afford not to listen. But they also had a very good understanding of what her overall podcast was about, which meant that after the episode was done, they looked through her back catalog to look at other episodes that were highly relevant to them, because again, they knew the overall show was for them. Mistake number 2, set and forgetting your podcast show description. Yeah, you know that thing that you did probably a while ago that you forgot about? That is affecting your ability to not only turn more strangers into listeners, but to get those listeners coming back for more. And here's the reason why. When a new listener discovers your podcast, one of the very first things that they look at is your podcast show description. I know this blew my mind as well. I personally didn't read show descriptions, but it's a common thing that happens. Now, where the issue lies is that most people set and forget their podcast show description. So when new listeners discover your show through an episode or through a guest speaker that you had on your podcast, and they are probably interested, they maybe love the show, when they go to show description to see what the show is about, and it's either super long, boring, drawn out, or it's not really focused on what that particular person is going to gain, and it's not really clear and specific who the show is specifically for. It's more generalized information about your podcast overall. What happens is you've then missed out on the stranger on your overall show, which means that even though they might have been the perfect person for the podcast, they went to a description, they read it to see what the overall gist is, and they didn't really feel like it was for them. They didn't resonate. So they listened to that one episode and then they just bounce. Once again, this is an issue and a missed opportunity to keep that listener coming back for more. Now, the simple fix for this is making sure that your show description is highly targeted, speaking to one specific type of person, positioning your show as something wildly attractive to the exact listener you're trying to reach, and letting them know exactly what they're going to gain by listening to the podcast. It's so simple, but just by you explicitly stating exactly who the show is for, that will instantly show that person the benefit of your entire show, not just the episode they've just consumed. And in doing so, they'll actually take the time to look at your back catalog, hit subscribe, and listen to future content once you upload them. That's mistake number 2, set and forgetting your podcast show description. Mistake number 3 is having a broad and untargeted content strategy. If you have a podcast, let's say that is all around health and fitness, you might interview a bunch of different guests talking about different parts of health and fitness. Maybe you talk about the heart health, Maybe you talk about sleeping. Maybe you talk about cardio. Maybe you talk about weightlifting. Maybe you talk about veganism. Maybe you talk about specific diets. When you have a general content strategy that's unfocused, it means that you're not able to build a loyal fan base who come to your show for one specific topic. Now, you might say to yourself, but isn't health and fitness a specific topic? Well, it's not, right, because it's technically an umbrella term for a variety of different topics. So if you have an episode that blows up that's about veganism, and then you have a bunch of new listeners flock to your show and they listen, and the next episode is about weightlifting, and then one after that is about getting better sleep, what are the chances those listeners stick around for those other episodes? If you have a broad and unfocused content strategy, people really don't have a reason to keep listening to your podcast because, again, it's broad, it's scattered, and is not serving their specific needs at that particular point in time. They came for your podcast because they love veganism, so keep giving them more of that. And I remember we had a client who had this exact issue. His podcast was called broadly, it wasn't about veganism, but it was all about business and freedom. It was a client called Ben. He launched the show because he wanted to talk about freedom and business. And he had seen people like Stephen Bartlett talk about a wide range of topics. So he thought, why don't I do the same? So he started a show, and 2 years in, he couldn't break past 30 to 40 downloads per episode. And for him, it was super embarrassed because his show gave off the perception that was way bigger than what it was. He had these great guests on, spoke about business, mindset, resilience, but his show wasn't growing because it was covering a wide range of topics. But as soon as we got him way more focused and we pivoted his show where it was more about tools for electricians, how electricians can go self-employed to save more time and make more money, every single episode covered those specific topics, which meant that when he promoted on social media, people knew exactly who his show was for, what it was about. It meant that when he had an episode blow up, a bunch of people actually stuck around long term because the entirety of the show was made for them. This took him from struggling to hit 30 to 40 downloads per episode to getting well over 500, 600, even 700 downloads per episode. And this happened within a matter of 90 days. That's the power of being able to fix your attention strategy and have more listeners coming back for more. Mistake number 4. One thing that most people don't realize affects their show's ability to keep listeners binging and coming back for more is having an interview-focused podcast. Because if you think about it, in order to keep listeners coming back for more, your listeners also need to have a consistent experience with your show. Let's say, for example, one day you went to a barber, you got a haircut, and it was amazing. You loved it. You were like, holy crap, Fernando is a legend. And then the next week you go to the same barber because, of course, you had the best haircut on planet Earth. The next week you go in and there's a different barber. He sits down, he gives you a haircut, and to be honest with you, it's pretty bad. Now, of course, you're still thinking to yourself, okay, that was a bad experience, but it's fine, it's whatever. You still pay him, you go away. The following week you come back once again and there's a different barber. And you're thinking, what the hell, Fernando was an amazing experience. Anyways, you sit down, you get your haircut once again. And this time, the haircut wasn't bad, but it also wasn't great. It wasn't the Fernando haircut that you were looking for. What are the chances you go back to that same barber the next week? Very low. And the reason is because every time you go to the barber, you're having a different experience. I would never go back. I would go find another Fernando. And the reason is this, right? I had a great experience my first time round. That convinced me to come back a second time. The second time, the experience was totally different and I didn't really like it. I got a crap haircut. But I thought, you know what, I'm going to give it one more go. I then go back once again and it just wasn't what I was looking for. So why would I keep going back when the quality of experience I'm having varies so much and it isn't exactly what I'm looking for? Now, what the hell does this have to do with you interviewing guests onto your show, and how does it affect your ability to keep listeners coming back for more? Well, the exact same thing is happening when you have different guests onto your podcast to interview. Your listeners might love one guest because their energy is great, because they're super high energy, they're great at storytelling, and they just have a certain vibe to them. But then the next episode, you have a different guest and the energy is okay. They're more analytical and logical and their vibe is good, but they just seem a lot more serious. They don't really tell that many stories. But again, your audience loved the guy that was high energy and was a great storyteller. So now they're experiencing your show and love the first episode. But then the next episode is a bit dry and not quite what they're looking for. It's not quite hitting their taste buds in the right way. And then the next guest you get on after that, his energy was really high, but he was a terrible storyteller. He explained things in very long-winded types of way. But that's exactly what's going on with your show if you're interviewing a bunch of different guests. And look, you know as well as I, the quality and the variation of guests you have onto your show, it varies a lot. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's terrible, and other times you're thinking, why the hell am I interviewing this guy? He clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. This is so boring. I'm bloody bored, let alone my listeners. But you post it anyways. And when you have a podcast where every single episode is into a wide range of guests with different energies, different style of creating content, different energy, a different vibe, a different way of explaining things, different levels of storytelling, things get pretty difficult. It gets hard to keep the quality consistent, which also means your audience will experience that and they'll find another show that gives them that same experience every single time. Now, for our clients, what we found is that by simply switching from prioritizing interview style shows and switching to more solo focused content, meaning it's just them on a mic, we find that their show starts growing way more because every single episode, their audience knows exactly what they're going to get. They know the style, the vibe. They are familiar with the tone of the host. It's not 1 week it's high energy, the next week is boring as fuck. It's the exact same thing every time, and that's what they get hooked on. So for you, if you are prioritizing interviews, maybe start experimenting with solo podcasts where you're the one delivering the value in your unique way. This will get way more listeners coming back for more, binging your content and helping you grow way faster. It also means that when it comes to actually monetizing your podcast, you're not stuck promoting someone else, and the response rate of people joining your newsletter or buying your stuff goes way higher because you're the one who is being seen as the authority. You're no longer the person putting a spotlight on a different guest and giving them a bunch of credibility and authority. You're the person providing value and then extending your arm to your listeners saying, if you want to work with me personally to solve this specific problem, then go to this website and sign up. If you want my newsletter will provide even more value, go sign up. But if you're just constantly interviewing guests, your audience don't really know why they should work with you. If anything, you're giving your guests more business. So when it comes to driving way more sales for your podcast as well, doing way more solid podcasts will help. And also, if you want to generate more sales from your podcast, you need to have a deep level of trust with your audience. And that comes by your audience binging more of your content. And if they don't because your quality is inconsistent, because you're interviewing a bunch of different guests, you'll never monetize anyways. So once again, mistake number 4 is prioritizing interviewing guests instead of having a consistency and the quality of episodes you're able to deliver for your audience. And then mistake number 5, hosting weekly. I know it sounds kind of odd, like how can posting every single week affect your ability to keep listeners coming back for more? Now, this one might sound a bit weird because most people have a weekly podcast. Now, based off experience, we've found that having a weekly show is great once you have a gigantic audience and people know, like, and trust you. But if you want to keep more listeners coming back for more, it means that people need to become familiar with your voice, with your tone, with your energy. Now, if you're posting once a week and people are distracted, I don't know about you, but I get pretty distracted. There's a bunch of different creators out there and your audience are likely distracted as well. So let's say you have a bunch of new listeners who discover your podcast for the first time and they actually really enjoyed your episode. And let's say you fix up all the issues we spoke about. You have a strong intro that convinces them to listen to the actual episode and gives them an amazing experience. You have a focused content strategy where every single episode is specifically made with a listener in mind. And you also have more solo podcasts where you're consistently delivering high quality content with the same vibe, same energy, same style of content that your audience love. You can still not get listeners coming back for more if they're unable to fit you into their weekly routine. The reason is most people listen to podcasts out of habit, out of routine. And in order to build a habit, it requires repetition on a consistent basis. So if I want to get used to going to the gym, I can't just go once a week and think I'm going to just start learning, fall in love with working out. I need to go at least 3 to 4 times a week and find my weekly cadence. After a month of me going 3 to 4 times a week, I would have probably built more of a habit. It will become easier for me to go to the gym. The exact same thing is true for your podcast. Your audience needs to listen to you way more in order to get used to your tonality, to your voice, to your banter, to your style. I don't know if you guys have ever had it where like you meet someone and your first impression of them, you think that guy seems like a bit of a douche, right? And then you spend more and more time with him because all your other friends like him for some random reason, but you can't quite see it yet. And then out of nowhere, there's one experience with him where you realize you're laughing with him, you're cracking up, and you finally get the guy, right? And now you're familiar with him. You know the feeling where you're like, oh my God, I love that guy. He's great. He's amazing energy. Oh, he's good. He's Dave. It's Fernando. Is Fernando going to be coming out with us tonight? Fernando being the guy that you didn't used to like, right? And it's because it takes us time to warm up to certain people, to their tone, to their style, their energy. Now, the exact same thing is happening with your podcast. The likelihood is people don't just listen to your podcast once and then become a super fan. No, they listen to your podcast over and over and over again, fit it as part of their routine, and then they build that like, know, and trust. They get your banter, your energy, your style. They get the flow of conversation of how you present things and how you talk about things. Now, if you're publishing once a week, it's going to be very hard to speed up that process of like, know, and trust because you're publishing once a week. They might get distracted, forget about your show, even though they like you the first time. But if you just publish, literally, let's say every Mondays and Thursdays, twice a week, you're now speeding up the like, know, and trust. It also means that if you're publishing twice a week instead of once a week, when you publish that second episode and they open up their streaming platform like Apple or Spotify, your show will actually come up as a new episode, which means they're seeing you every few days instead of just once a week. And by nature of them seeing you more often, they become more familiar with your show's name. They are far more likely to click play and listen. And by us speeding up that like, know, trust, we get way more people not ditching our content after episode 1, but falling in love with our content and podcast because they've built up that like, know, and trust. Now, if you want to grow fast, get big, and monetize your podcast way faster, you need your audience to actually like, know, and trust you. And if you want to do it faster, you need a way to get them consuming more of your content. And uploading twice a week is such a simple solution for that. So look, if you haven't podcasted for a couple of years, I want to let you know that it is worth it. You can do it. Podcasting is a ton of fun, but it can be a pain in the butt if you are struggling to grow. And all I want to do is just share with you some things that I've noticed with my clients, with myself, with my show. And all I want to do is help you gain more clarity around why your show isn't growing as fast as you'd like. Because it's not just as simple as, let's just get a ton of exposure onto my podcast and it will grow. I wish it were that simple, but it's not. There are these other underlying elements that we often skip over because we just think we have them handled when in actuality we oftentimes don't. And by us just ignoring these things, like how do we get more strangers clicking play and listen to our show when I do promote? And how do I make sure that if I'm promoting constantly on social media and people are enjoying my episode, that I get more of them coming back for more? So I hope this has shed some light on simple changes that you can make to grow and monetize your podcast way faster. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next video.